Hello, kids. It's time for Presidents 31 through 35. This one's going to be pretty tough. I got the Great Depression, World War II, and the beginning of the Cold War to get to, but have no fear. It's time to do what we normally do. Here we go. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Harrison. You guys can say it with me. John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, Ulysses S. Grant, Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, Grover Cleveland the first time, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland the second time, William McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Warren G. Harding, and Calvin Coolidge. We left off in, I believe, the year 1929. Okay, so here we are. We are in the year 1929, and we're going to go all the way up to 1963. So this is going to be, looks like a 29 to 59 would be 30 years, so it looks like a 34-year period. So we're going to talk about these presidents in the context of an industrializing nation on the rise after World War I, otherwise known as the Great War, and after the Roaring Twenties, which really saw a transformation of culture with radio and movies, new pop culture era. And now we are in 1929 with Herbert Hoover. Oh my lord, I forgot my chart. Looks like I'm gonna have to go grab that real quick. If you kids are asking where the chart is, yeah, you are right. Mr. Adam forgot it. But have no fear. I like to be a one take kind of guy. And this also makes it more exciting for you. So, sorry about that, kids. Here we go. Herbert Hoover. What's his background? Herbert Hoover was born into a Quaker family in Iowa. He studied geology at Stanford and then went to work for mining companies in Australia. His success in the mining industry made him a millionaire. At the age of 40, he left the mining industry and went into politics. He wanted to be the Secretary of Commerce. He was a proponent of the efficiency movement, which argued that life could be improved by finding ways of minimizing waste. He helped establish standard codes for air travel and for road traffic. He also got the government to regulate radio frequencies. Very interesting background there, very important work. Herbert Hoover. Okay. Yeah, here we go. When Hoover became president, there was a Wall Street crash. The Great Depression began under Hoover's presidency. During the Roaring Twenties, investors had become over-optimistic in the economy, which led businesses to continually increase their production. Eventually, production overshot what people could consume and prices plummeted. Investors panicked and pulled their money out of the stock market, which caused it to crash. Much of the stock was bought with loans people could not pay back, and so banks started to fail as well. The general population started to pull their money out of banks in fear that they would lose their money, and this caused an avalanche of bank failures. So this is just a snowball going downhill at this point. Although Hoover made attempts at stimulating the economy through government spending, he was not willing to go into debt to give people jobs. People started calling the shanty towns around the country Hoovervilles. Yeah, Black Thursday in America. Take a look at this card. Very important. Great Depression. All right, so foreign policy. Although Hoover was not willing to spend money to create jobs, He was willing to create jobs by sending Mexicans back to their home country, Mexico. He sent over 50,000 Mexican Americans back to Mexico to help improve the job market for what he thought for people back here in America. He also supported the Stimson Doctrine. This was a policy to not recognize any change of territory between countries, which was caused by war. So Hoover is making some decisions here that we may not necessarily agree with today. He's not, I don't quite understand what's going on here, Hoover, but we live in a different time now. All right, so let's talk about Hoover. Not much there. Background covered. 1921 to 1929, he served as Secretary of Commerce for Presidents Harding and Coolidge. He reorganized and expanded the department, sponsoring conferences on unemployment, fostering trade associations, and generating projects like the St. Lawrence Seaway and the monumental dam that would bear his name, the Hoover Dam. He won the 1928 Republican nomination and defeated Alfred E. Smith in the election. He created the Federal Farm Board to address the needs of agriculture. In October of 1929, the stock market crashed, plunging the country into chaos and setting off the Great Depression. In 1932, 15,000 veterans marched on Washington to cash in war bonus certificates, and then Hoover responded by having them forcibly removed from federal property. And he was very unpopular by the time of the election in 1933, and he was defeated by one of the most important presidents that we ever had, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So Herbert Hoover, president from 1929 to 1933, and now we are on to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was president from 1903 to 1945, the longest serving president we've ever had. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born into one of New York's wealthiest and well-connected families, which had already produced one president, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt went into politics at a young age. He was a progressive Democrat who supported government intervening in the economy to improve people's lives. He served under another progressive Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. During the 1932 presidential election, Roosevelt offered the country a New Deal. This is very important. A New Deal from what they were getting from Hoover. He criticized Hoover for stifling business by interfering with the economy. Ironically, Roosevelt would expand the role of government more than ever. Yeah, so he ran on the New Deal platform. The New Deal is one of the most important things that he did to get the people out of the Great Depression. Most of us remember FDR as the wartime president during World War II, but actually, most of his work was actually done in the 1930s, trying to pull the United States out of the Great Depression. So let's talk about his domestic policy. Roosevelt took office at a time when a quarter of the workforce, 25% of the workforce, was unemployed and industrial production was half it was a few years ago. His first goal was to stop the panicking in the country. In his inauguration speech, he famously said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He set the tone of his presidency by condemning the runaway greed of investors on Wall Street that had caused the economic collapse. He established that he was going to fight for the common man without concern for the, quote, unscrupulous money changers, end quote, who had wrecked the economy. The day after his inauguration, he declared a bank holiday to stop the run on the banks. He then started his New Deal programs, which put Americans back to work by using government money. Roosevelt's high popularity made him the only president to get elected to 4 terms. It was actually later, a lot of people think that it was always the case that presidents could only get elected to 2 terms, but that actually wasn't the case. I think it was that nobody had ever run more than twice, because that was just sort of the tradition that went all the way back to George Washington. But that had never been the case. It actually became the case later that you could no longer run for more than 2 terms. But Roosevelt was elected, I believe, 4 times, and then, of course, he died while he was president, and then Truman became president, his vice president. All right, he was the only president to get elected to 4 terms. All right, so war broke out in Europe when Germany invaded in Poland in 1939. Very important fact, World War II, 1939, all the way to 1945. Roosevelt professed neutrality as the anti war sentiment in the country was very strong. He wanted to stay neutral, but he did what he could to build up the military for war. He also sold arms to Britain and France to help them resist Germany. And by the way, the US made a lot of money doing this, okay? After a wave of countries fell to Nazi Germany, including France, Congress got behind Roosevelt's efforts to build up arms. When he ran for re-election, Roosevelt still professed neutrality as the isolationist movement in the country was still strong. There's always a streak in American politics to isolate ourselves. There's been a streak all the way going back to the earliest presidents to let other countries handle their business and we handle ours. This is called isolationism, and it sort of shows up in ebbs and flows across the history of the United States. However, his isolationism was going to go out the window here in a second because Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. He famously said, I believe, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Okay? After the attack, the United States declared war on Germany and Japan. Along with Britain and the Soviet Union, the U.S. defeated Germany and Japan. However, Roosevelt died due to a brain hemorrhage months before the war ended. Okay? So, yeah, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, incredibly important president. I want to hold up the foreign policy here. I'll also hold up the domestic policy. World War II was, in many ways, a continuation of World War I. Adolf Hitler had been a corporal in Germany during World War I, and the reparations or the penalties that Germany had to pay at that time after World War I were very, very heavy. And it sank Germany into a depression during this period known as the Weimar Republic period. When Adolf Hitler came to power in the mid-1930s in Germany and wanted to expand German interests, this was a very delicate time in politics because many people were pursuing a policy of what you would call appeasement. Neville Chamberlain, famously in Great Britain, was doing this. But Hitler was pushing it too far when he finally invaded Poland. And it's not like he had not been going into other places already. And this is what plunged the world into war. The U.S. wanted to stay out, but we got involved when Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th in 1941. So that's when the U.S. got involved in World War II. So let's talk some facts about FDR. Let's see here. Yeah, so we had John N. Garner as his vice president for his first two terms. His third term, Henry A. Wallace was his vice president. And for his fourth term, which he did not really get to serve out because he died, it was Harry Truman. The first lady was Eleanor Roosevelt. The sole U.S. president to be elected to 3, let alone 4 times. From the Roosevelt family. He called the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor dastardly, and he asked Congress to declare war. He worked closely with Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. Okay. And the Allies, which were what the good guys, as I call them, the good guys, the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain were called, defeated the Axis powers. Those were the bad guys, primarily Germany and Japan with some of their allies. So Allies versus Axis. Okay. Yeah, he kept Americans informed of what was going on during the 1930s with what are called the fireside chats. He was a force of stability during a very, very dark time in the U.S. economy. In fact, we were reading To Kill a Mockingbird when we do that unit with the middle schoolers, that is actually set in the midst of the Great Depression. And some of the characters in the book are talking about some of the New Deal policies that are trying to get people back to work in Alabama. All right, so let's go to President number 33, who was president from 1945 to 1953, Harry S. Truman. Harry Truman was born on a farm in Missouri. He did not go to college. Instead, he cheated on his eye exam to get into the Army. During World War I, he distinguished himself as an officer who kept discipline and kept his men alive. He rose to the rank of captain by the time the war ended. After the war, he tried and failed to go into business, so he decided to go into politics instead. During the early years of World War II, Truman made a name for himself by creating a committee that went after businesses who were wasting or stealing money. He saved the country billions of dollars and found himself on the cover of Time magazine for keeping government contractors honest through the war effort. So here is Harry Truman. Background. And I must say, Harry Truman wasn't necessarily a great president, but Harry Truman, I'll just say this before I go any further, he found himself in some of the most extraordinary circumstances that any president ever found themselves. The world, the country was transformed under Truman's presidency for so many different reasons. After World War II, the reorganization of the U.S. military, the beginning of the Cold War, and most notably, how he ended World War II against Japan with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He was put into some extraordinary circumstances. It's a fascinating time studying the presidency of Truman. If I was to study any president more deeply, it would be him. All right, so domestic policy. Truman had to deal with many labor problems at home after the war. The war had provided jobs to everyone, but now it was over. Yeah, that's right. World War II pretty much ended the Great Depression. So the Great Depression pretty much lasted 1929 until the outbreak of World War II, late 30s, early 40s. Okay. The Taft-Hartley Act was passed under Truman. Even though he tried to veto it, it severely restricted the ability of workers to strike. Truman's popularity dropped throughout the country during this economic turmoil. The policies that Truman offered the country were called the Fair Deal. Many of these policies were taken from Roosevelt's Second Bill of Rights, which he had proposed in his fourth term but never got to implement or put into place. Among these policies were universal health care and raising the minimum wage to a living wage. Truman could not get his Fair Deal passed the conservative coalition of Republicans in Congress. And yeah, if you notice, we got Hoover, who's a Republican, and now we've got two Democrats in Delano Roosevelt and Truman. So he's trying to get the Fair Deal passed, but it is not working. All right, so this card might be the most important card of this entire section, with no offense to anything FDR did, but the game-changing science behind the atomic bomb was incredible. And in fact, today, April 22nd, is Earth Day. One thing I did not mention during my line time when I covered this was that April 22nd was also the birthday of Robert Oppenheimer, who was called the father of the atomic bomb. I don't know if they knew that when they founded Earth Day, but Oppenheimer was devastated by what his creation could do. So yeah, I was actually looking at that today. Today is also the birthday. April 22nd is also the birthday. I believe he was born in 1904. Maybe somebody looked that up. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, was born today, although today is also Earth Day. I did not mention that at line time, but it is an interesting historical note. All right. After getting elected to his fourth term, Roosevelt died 82 days into office, and Truman became president. Truman inherited the massive project of ending World War II. The Allied armies had already defeated Germany's forces in Europe, classic D-Day invasions, of course, but Japan remained fighting in the Pacific. Okay, the Pacific theater of the war is what that was called. At the time, a secret project called the Manhattan Project was developing an atomic bomb. Truman authorized dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to get Japan to surrender, which they did. After the war, the United Nations was formed to stop nations from making wars of aggression. And remember, Woodrow Wilson had tried to do something like this with the League of Nations, never lived to see it happen, and in fact, his successors rejected the idea. In 1950, the United Nations voted on going to war with North Korea to prevent them from conquering South Korea. The U.S. military provided most of the forces. Yeah, so what we're in here with Truman is not only the end of World War II, but the beginning of one of the most important periods in U.S. history, at least within the last, I don't know how, talking about it with kids, what I would say to you kids is that there is something called the Cold War that began in 1947. The Cold War was not an out-and-out war, but it was a war of influence between two major countries, the United States and our Democratic Republic form of government, and the USSR, the Soviet Union, and their communist form of government. and they competed for influence all around the world, Latin America, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, for influence and to form governments that were amenable to their ways of being. And North Korea ended up becoming communist, and South Korea did not. This is one example. The Korean War was an undeclared war, and that's a very interesting. It's almost every war after World War II is going to become an undeclared war. Vietnam is going to come later. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But the Korean War and all of these conflicts, beginning with the Cold War, where you have other people fighting on behalf of U.S. or Soviet interests, goes all the way from 1947 to 1991. Okay, so you've got the Berlin blockade, you've got the Korean War, you've got the Chinese Civil War, you've got a lot of things going on, and it begins right here during Truman's presidency. And this is when the United States is really transformed into what it is now, especially on the military spending side of things, especially with the arms race, the idea that who's going to have the most nuclear weapons and who's going to make even more powerful ones. The atomic bombs that they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki are very, very weak compared to the ones that they were building just 10 years after that and testing all around the world, the Soviet Union and the United States. So let's talk a little bit about Truman. Yeah, Truman. Yeah, he's from Missouri. He had the idea of containing the communism called the Truman Doctrine. He wanted to contain the spread of communism. Yeah, he actually later on, when the Korean War broke out, he relieved the famous General MacArthur of command that proved to be very unpopular, and he ended up not getting reelected after that. Of course, a war hero came to power as president after that in Dwight D. Eisenhower. But there's a lot of anxiety in the United States beginning under Truman about the spread of communism. All right, so let's go to Dwight D. Eisenhower, who's a Republican, a war hero. And he is president from 1953 to 1961. He's a two-termer. All right, so Dwight D. Eisenhower had a rather uneventful career in the Army until World War II came around. During World War I, he wanted to get sent overseas, but instead he was put in charge of training a tank corps. Over the years, he gained a reputation in the Army for being a good organizer and for working well with generals. After the United States joined the Allies to fight in World War II, he was put to use as a war planner in Washington. He fell under the wing of the current Chief of Staff of the Army, General George Marshall, who liked him and promoted him. Eisenhower's success in the Mediterranean theater of the war got him promoted to Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, and he commanded the Allies to victory over Germany. So he eventually became the highest general in the United States at the end of World War II. All right, so Eisenhower continued with the Democrats' New Deal programs. In fact, despite his professions of wanting a small government, he enacted the largest public work program of all time with the interstate highway system. Yeah, we take for granted that we have highways around today. They did not exist before this program was begun. So we think about all these highways and all the special numbers and stuff that mean certain things. That did not really exist before Eisenhower. He also did the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. Those were both created under Eisenhower. They were created after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite, into orbit. Yeah, the United States was very upset that the Soviet Union was the first into space. This was the space race. And in fact, there's a lot of cool reading you could do about what happened after World War II with the Soviet Union and the United States really both trying to get former German scientists. There was something called Operation Paperclip, where the United States was trying to get these scientists to come work for American interests. And they did get some of them, but the Soviet Union got some of them too. And they're all putting them to work on missile programs and on space programs, et cetera, et cetera. So the Sputnik launching caused fear throughout the nation, And people thought that we were falling behind in technology. And of course, starting with Truman, but under Eisenhower, the United States is doing a lot of work to try to make sure that we do not fall behind. I could go on and on about that, but I won't. On the issue of civil rights, Eisenhower was a strong supporter of integration. When the Supreme Court decided that segregation of schools was unconstitutional, Eisenhower used federal troops to enforce the law. Very famous for that. All right, so let's talk about his foreign policy. I don't know if I held up the domestic policy, but here's his foreign policy. As president, Eisenhower's main objectives were to balance the budget and to end the war in Korea. He ended the military stalemate in Korea by threatening to use nuclear bombs on China. At the time, only the US and the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, and the Soviets never had good relations with China. China relented, and Korea was divided into two countries. A similar situation occurred in Vietnam, where the French colonial rulers were attacked by communists. Eisenhower tried to support the French by sending them arms, but after the French relented, he sent arms to the Vietnamese leader there. Communism, in fact, defined here, is a political ideology where the state owns everything and wealth is shared equally. However, the equality comes at the price of having very little individual freedom. So during Eisenhower's presidency is when you get the very beginnings of what's going to become the Vietnam War that's going to consume much of the 60s. France is the first to get involved. I believe France gets involved as early as 1957 here. And I believe Vietnam ends finally, officially in 1975 before I was born. I was born in October. I believe it ended before then. So I believe that is correct, 57 to 75, but I'm going to have to double check that. So we have the very, again, the Vietnam War is also a part of the Cold War. This is just another one of those places around the world where the Soviet Union and the United States are vying for power, and you also have these former colonies around the world that are also in the midst of this trying to figure out how they are going to establish their own governments. And if they receive help from the Soviet Union, it's going to look one way. If they receive help from the United States, it's going to look another. All right. Dwight D. Eisenhower. It was under Eisenhower's executive direction that Operation D-Day, the invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, was carried out, and the world stage set for Germany's surrender. When he returned to Washington, it was as a 5-star general. His career was then capped with his appointment as Army Chief of Staff. With his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower sought to contain communism while ensuring peace. These were the years when Senator Joseph McCarthy rose to power, persecuting suspected Americans of communism. Eisenhower did enforce school desegregation in Arkansas and signed civil rights acts in 1957 and 1960. Under Eisenhower, the U.S. enjoyed its most prosperous economy since the 1920s. He lifted the ceilings on wages, did away with price controls, and came close, but he did not actually balance the federal budget. There's the famous thing, I like Ike, as far as getting himself elected there. Yeah, Eisenhower was a very popular president throughout the 1950s. All right, so let's talk about John F. Kennedy. So John F. Kennedy was president from 1961 to 1963. He was born into a wealthy and prominent family. As a young man, Kennedy enjoyed the life of a rich kid and didn't take things too seriously. Part of the reason for Kennedy's laid-back attitude was that he tired very easily. He had what's called Addison's disease. And during the war, he served on a torpedo boat called a PT-109. The rough waves were hard on him because his disease had degenerated the disc between his vertebrae. However, he wanted the job and he served heroically. When a Japanese destroyer rammed and destroyed his boat, he towed an injured crewman to a nearby island by swimming and holding the man's life jacket strap in his teeth. So Kennedy, despite having Addison's disease, did do some work in World War II. Made himself a hero there. Good job. Kennedy narrowly won the election in 1961. Remember, he's a Democrat here. He got 0.2% more votes than his opponent, Richard Nixon. During his inauguration address, he tried to appeal to liberals and conservatives by arguing that individual action had to work together with government action to improve the country and the world. He famously said in his speech, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Kennedy called his policies the New Frontier. He wanted to spend money on education, healthcare, and aid to the poor. He also wanted to help put an end of racial discrimination. The space race also began under Kennedy. Kennedy proposed to send a man to the moon before the end of the decade. He did not get to see many of the policies go into effect because he was assassinated by a lone gunman in 1963. Yes, so he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in 1963. I believe it was in Dallas, Texas. All right, so foreign policy. This is actually really an interesting part of Kennedy's presidency. Early in his office, Kennedy had to deal with some major challenges in foreign policy, primarily in dealing with Cuba, communist Cuba. After a communist revolution, Fidel Castro had come to power in 1959. The Eisenhower administration planned to overthrow Castro by training exiled Cubans to invade the country in what was called the Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy inherited this plan and decided to go through with it. It was a bad idea because it was a colossal failure. This led Cuba and the Soviet Union responding by the Soviets sending nuclear weapons to Cuba to deter the U.S. from invasion. You guys have to remember that Cuba is not that far from Florida. It's very, very close. So this is a very strategic point for nuclear missiles to go right next to the United States. When a U.S. spy plane, I believe it was a U-2, discovered the missiles, Kennedy was forced to act. Kennedy imposed a naval blockade on Cuba to prevent ships from sending more missiles. Nikita Khrushchev, the head of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, responded to Kennedy by telling him that this was an act of aggression propelling humankind into the abyss of a world nuclear missile war. Eventually, the crisis ended when the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba if the United States agreed not to invade Cuba and to remove their own missiles from Turkey. So the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs invasion leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis was a really, really big deal. October 1962 was one of the most stressful times in U.S. history because this was when all of this was playing out. And it was not, we weren't sure whether the world was going to go to war or not with nuclear weapons. So this was, I know my parents lived through this, had a lot of stories to tell about this. Yeah, this was a really, really big deal. This was the closest that the Cold War came to an out-and-out war between the two major players behind the scenes, the United States and the Soviet Union. John F. Kennedy was the first Catholic, I believe, to be elected. He was, at age 43, the youngest man to be elected at that time to the presidency. His vice president was Lyndon B. Johnson. Jackie Kennedy, his first lady. His vice president, conflicts in Vietnam intensified, and Kennedy bowed to the CIA and the Pentagon, who pressured him to send in more military. On November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, as he rode in an open car beside his beautiful wife and smiled for all his might and well-wishers, Kennedy was killed, the first president to be killed in office since McKinley. And 5 years later, his brother Robert, the Attorney General, was also killed. The Warren Commission was convened to investigate the president's assassination. They concluded that it was the act of the lone gunman Lee Harvey Oswald. Many have insisted that it was a massive conspiracy, a theory that for all practical purposes continues to strain belief. So yeah, there's always been conspiracy theories about the death of Kennedy as our 35th president. He was president from 1961 to 1963. So there's a lot going on here with these presidents. I will tell you this, that the transition from the Great Depression through World War II and into the Cold War, there is a lot of changes. The United States is transforming right now. It's looking a lot different than it did with Theodore Roosevelt. I'm looking, even Woodrow Wilson. It's a lot different now. So we are a nation now, and if you look at the pictures. The first two to be in color are right here with Eisenhower and Kennedy. All right, so I've gone a little long, but really had to talk about the Depression, World War II, and the Cold War a bit. Hope you enjoyed this presentation. Let's learn those presidents. Bye, kids.